This session's budget forecasting. We were fortunate enough to get Shane Kavanaugh, Senior Manager of Research from our National GFOA, to talk to us about budget. One thing I want to mention from last session, if you weren't able to answer the polling question, you're still getting credits. Hopefully we can do a better job this time. And also for the benefit of our panelists, I neglected to mention that before we started. At some point during the presentation, we'll have an awkward pause when we bring in a polling question to make sure that the now 187 participants are still awake and still breathing. So I will turn it over to Shane. Thank you.
Actually, just before Shane goes, Jerry, I want to give him a little bit more credit than that.
Okay.
As Jerry said, Shane is the Senior Manager of Research for GFOA. And has been a leader in developing the practice and technique of long-term financial planning and policies for local government. Shane's responsible for starting GFOA's long-term financial planning and policy consulting offering in 2002. So he goes out and helps people do what they need to do, which is what he's going to talk about here. He's author of many publications. I'm not going to list them, but that's actually how I found Shane. Originally, Roy Rigatano and I were going to do this session on forecasting and said, how cool would it be to get somebody that does it on a national level and has some input into big towns, small towns all over the country. And so in addition for Shane, prior to joining GFOA, Shane was the assistant village manager for the village of Palos Park. Did I do that right? Palos Park, Illinois, where he was responsible for managing all aspects of financial management operations, including budgeting, utility billing, payroll, accounting, all the stuff we do. And he received his MBA degree from the Northern Illinois University. So with that, Shane, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you to the GFOA of New Jersey for having me here today to talk about forecasting. So the angle that I'm going to take on this is know your risks. We are in an uncertain time, and risk goes along with uncertainty. So I think that's a pretty good lens to put on forecasting nowadays. So let's start out with something called the AAA approach to risk. So this is a nice little framework that can help you organize your thinking when it comes to risk, not only for forecasting, but pretty much for any other risk you might have to deal with in finance. And of course, in finances, there is no shortage of risk to think about. So let's see what the AAA actually is. So the AAA has three parts to it. The first part is that you need to accept that uncertainty is inevitable. And that sounds like a pretty basic step, but many folks don't accept uncertainty in their life, right? They think, well, the future is going to be pretty much like the past, and that's how, all there is to it. But no, we need to accept that there is volatility in life. Now, I would think that COVID-19 would perhaps make us permanently accept that uncertainty is a thing, but nevertheless, it is part of the AAA three-step approach. The next step is to identify the potential impact. So do some analysis to think about what the impact of uncertainty might be. And then lastly is augment. And the idea here is that uncertainty is usually going to be underestimated. And I'll get into that in a bit. But for now, suffice to say that it's important to have a third step specifically dedicated to increasing our expectations for uncertainty beyond what we thought or came up with in the first two steps. So now some good news, we're ahead of the game, as I said, because as I said in 2020, I think by now we've all accepted that uncertainty is a thing. So I would consider step one in AAA largely complete. So we're gonna get past step one and we're gonna start getting into some other steps. So first step is, how do we assess uncertainty then? If that step one is accepted, step two is to assess it. How do we assess? I would suggest to you that a good way to assess is using analogs, and analogs provide a kind of a reference point for uncertain situations, because you really need some sort of reference point. If you don't have one, you're essentially going to be unmoored, and unmoored and adrift is not a good position to be in. Now, certainly COVID is a new kind of uncertainty, but I don't think that means we need to give up on analytical techniques and resort to just plain old gut decision making. In fact, I would submit to you that uncertain times are a particularly bad time to go with gut decision making. And you might ask, well, why is that? So let me show you a little bit why I believe that is a bad idea, as we say here in the slide, to go with your gut. All right, let's move on and see a little bit about that. So I'm gonna share with you some research from a colleague of mine, Doug Hubbard. He lives here in Chicago as well, and he is an author of the book that we show on the screen here, The Failure of Risk Management and How to Fix It. So he's done some really interesting firsthand direct research. So first point is that this is a little graphic that asks people, and this is a graphic of a study result, that asks people to assess their chance of being correct on some given situation. So like, let's say, and this is not necessarily limited to forecasting, but I'll just use forecasting examples. So what is the chance that your forecast is going to be at least, like, say, the actual revenue you get is going to be at your forecast or greater? What is the chance of your forecast being correct or something like this? And you put in, you say, well, I think the chance is 80%. If you were perfectly calibrated, as we say here in the slide, or kind of a perfect predictor, you should be correct 80% of the time. But when you do the research and compare people's predictions to how they actually do, you see this bottom line where people assess their chance of being correct at 80%. So you see right down here, 80% chance of being correct. They believe they're 80% chance of being correct. How often are they actually correct? 60% of the time. So do you want to be on this kind of line here is ideal, where if I say I'm going to be correct 80% of the time, I'm actually going to be correct 80% of the time? You do not want to say, well, I think I'm going to be 80% correct, but I'm only 50% correct. That the difference between these two lines is overconfidence. So people are routinely overconfident in their ability to assess these kind of uncertain situations. Next point here is that people are influenced by random and irrelevant factors and have difficulty replicating their own judgment. So let's just take our prior example here, where our sample question is, what is the chance of revenue coming in at or over your forecast? And you say, well, I think it's going to be like 70%. If I ask you the same question like a day later, assuming that you don't have massive new changes in information in the space of one day, you should give me that same percentage. But what this graphic shows is that if you were consistent, your dots would be on the line, right? Because you'd say, well, 70% the first time, 70% the second time, we'd have someone get on the line here. You would be consistent. But when you compare all these different estimators, their dots are all over the place, right? Like this person said, first one was 40%. The second one was like 25%. This one over here was the worst. Like first time was 85%. Second time was 50%. So people are all over the map with these estimates and not consistent when it comes to applying their gut. And here's some of the reasons why that might be, is that people are influenced by a lot of these irrelevant types of factors, and people around that are smiling decreases risk aversion. So you might say, well, I'm willing to roll the dice. If you recall an event that causes fear, that increases your risk aversion, and so on and so forth. Another one, recent win in an unrelated decision, recent loss in an unrelated decision. So that means, like, say, you bet on the game or something like this, and you lost your bet on a game. You would say, well, now I'm going to be more risk averse in, like, say, your forecasting because you lost a bet of some kind. So all of these irrelevant factors can change our willingness and our ability to assess risk. And one more little game we're going to play, or not a game, but thing I'm going to demonstrate here for you, and it is a little type of game, is one last thing, why we shouldn't go with the gut. So this little game here is called the probability guessing game, and I'm going to show you a string of randomly generated green and red dots. So here's our string randomly generated. And now I'm going to do is ask you guys to think about what dot color you will see next. I'm going to show you another line of dots, and you don't have to like shout them out or put them in the chat or anything, but just to yourself, think about what color dot would I expect to see next. I'm going to reveal them one at a time. And I'll just show the rest of the string. And that's the rest of the string. So now what's the takeaway from this as well? Takeaway is that when you have people play this game and people have to guess the dots, you can have them also compete against lab rats. And when you have people compete against the lab rats tend to win this game. And why is that, you might ask? It's because people look for patterns here. So this algorithm is basically saying that, you know what, red is going to show up 25% of the time, green is going to show up 75% of the time. And the rat sees mostly green, just guesses green all the time. So the rat is going to score a 75%. People, on the other hand, tend to look for patterns. And that's called the gambler's fallacy. Like, if there's a lot of greens in a row, well, there's been so many greens, I should catch red. And any single dot, you still have a 25% chance of getting a red. So it's always going to be a bad bet in any single instance. So people try to guess and outguess the system, and they end up getting it right 60% of the time. So the kind of point here is that we are not good at estimating these sort of uncertain situations from the gut, and we need a little help. And some of the techniques I'm going to describe in this presentation are designed to provide that little bit of help. And now you might wonder, kind of, well, okay, fair enough. You showed all this evidence that people are not good at this. Why are they not good at this? So let me show you why people are not good at this. So there's a series of, we'll say, predictably irrational behaviors that people engage in called cognitive biases. And let me just share a couple of those with you that are particularly relevant. So the first one is called the overconfidence bias, and how this relates to forecasting is that we are routinely overestimating our predictions and underestimating uncertainty. And in fact, uncertainty is underestimated by about 50%. And in fact, in our research and applied work, we've seen this. Just to give you one of my favorite examples, we were in a state out west estimating the potential cost from wildfires. So they wanted to figure out, like, well, if a wildfire hits our town, our county actually, what sort of damages might we see? And so we gathered some data from wildfires in the past history, and we had our range of potential data. And we asked their fire department to come up with their own estimate, and the fire department, using most of their judgment, came up with a range that was 50% narrower than our own range. So it was actually good information, because we know people are routinely 50% overconfident, but kind of told us our data was looking pretty good if the judgment of the fire department was kind of 50% of that. So the next point there that we're going to share is availability bias. And this means that details that are more easily recalled are overweighted when assessing risk. So for example, past history, what happened last time, these things can be overweighted pretty easily. And then lastly is confirmation bias, so random patterns taken of evidence that they match an expectation. And one of the stories here for that is we were working with a city where they're convinced that their revenue is very volatile. They're like, oh, our revenue is so volatile. There's so much kind of randomness in there. We don't really have the ability to forecast it. And when we took a look at the data, it was literally one of the least random patterns we've ever come across. What was going on is there's a lot of ups and downs, but when you look at those ups and downs across the multi-year history, they were super predictable, because the same pattern just kept repeating itself over and over and over again. If you kind of looked at it just month to month, you see a lot of up and downs. It did seem pretty volatile, but when you looked across it, the picture, not volatile. So kind of in the case of confirmation bias, they say, well, last month revenues went way up. This month they were way down. To them, that kind of confirmed the suspicion of randomness, when it turns out it was nothing of the sort. All right, so let's move on to how to assess, and that would be analogs and reference cases. We're going to see some examples of both those things that will be hopefully relevant to the New Jersey context. So the first thing I would like to share with you is a housing price index information. This is called the Case-Shiller Housing Price Index. It's a national index. And I pulled the national information here, but you can also pull information for big metropolitan areas like New York or Los Angeles or Chicago, and all, like many others. So there are different metropolitan areas you can full, but kind of the point that I wanted to bring up with you guys is to show that, yeah, of course, 2008 housing prices went way down. That's not a big surprise. 2001, not so much. You see like a little flattening out there. But kind of looking further back in history, we see in the early 90s there was a recession where housing prices actually went down a little bit as well. And there's a little bit of a myth that housing prices always go up and that 2008 was just some kind of totally weird anomaly. And certainly it was a weird anomaly in the amount that housing prices went down, but not a weird anomaly in that housing prices went down at all. So keeping in mind that housing prices could go down in this recession, it's too early to say what will happen. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but the point here is that we should be prepared for that because in many recessions they do go down. 2008 was historically large, but not unprecedented in the direction. And now just kind of share a little bit from the housing price index for what they're saying now is they're kind of pointing out the last time they measured this is that housing prices were stable in June. It kind of rose a little bit nationally, which was certainly good. But even the folks that put this together say that more data is going to be required to understand whether the market resumes this kind of path it was on we see before of accelerating prices, which you can see on the right-hand side of the graphic, or if maybe there's decrease or increasing deceleration, or maybe it's going to be stable. So the kind of folks that look at stuff professionally are still kind of waiting to see what happens. And they also make the point is that deceleration doesn't mean that prices will actually fall. It just could mean flattening. But I think the kind of bigger picture here is we need to be mindful that uncertainty is a possibility and the things could go in different directions than maybe we think. Next slide I want to share with you here is this is national permit data. So new privately owned housing units authorized by building permits. And you can see here, I don't think I need to point out which part of the graph is 2008, but I will point out 2001 and again the early 90s. And we can see the drop in the early 90s is actually pretty impressive. 2001, it's not that big a deal because 2001 was actually one of the smallest, if not the smallest recession in the post-war era. If you're measuring it by GDP decline, so 2001 is really quite mild. Early 90s is more like an average recession, and you can see the building permits dropped quite a bit. Nothing compared to 2008, but certainly not nothing. And I understand that building permits are an important source of revenues for many GFOA New Jersey members. So the kind of point being here is depending on which direction the economy goes, just thinking about that. Yeah, you know what? It's probably not going to be 2008, just because that was a historically anomalous recession focused on housing, but it's probably not going to be 2001 either. And we can see here on the graph that things are already starting to flatten out a little bit, just going through June. So as this goes forward, maybe it's not unreasonable to expect there might be a drop. And then kind of lastly here, I'll just kind of make the point that the economists did a issue at the end of 2020, worst ideas of the decade, and housing prices always rise were listed as one of those worst ideas of the decade. So this is the Washington Post and a contribution from The Economist magazine. So the idea being here is just to be accepting of uncertainty when it comes to housing and the direction that can take. All right, the kind of another point here, another tool for operating under uncertainty is what we call updating your priors. So in statistics, priors are what we know from before. So in other words, your judgments are going to be influenced by your prior experience. So you need to update that information with new information. And I'd like to just give you a little example from history of how not updating priors can be a very bad thing. And so how this example goes is in World War II, naval researchers conducted a study of damaged aircraft that returned from missions so they could make suggestions as to how to bolster defenses for future missions. So looking at where these returning planes have been hit, they concluded that areas that had taken the most damage should receive extra armor. Now, luckily, a statistician noticed that they were only sampling planes that survived missions, not the many planes that had been shot down. And he therefore theorized the opposite conclusion, which turned out to be correct, that the areas with the holes represented the areas where aircrafts could be shot and will still return safely, whereas the areas without the holes contain areas that, if hit, would cause the plane to go down. So how does this idea apply to revenue? So I'll give you an example. This is the history of revenue growth in various important revenue sources in 112 large cities from 2007 to 2012. And we notice here that user charges are the only one of these revenue areas that have experienced growth for this time period. So that's interesting. And if we look at this other graph, it's the same set of data just shown a different way. This is from 1977 and all the way up to 2017 again. Again, user charges leading the pack by a pretty large margin. Property taxes, not so much. State aid, not so much. Federal aid, definitely not. So user charges, people are relying on them quite a bit is the kind of takeaway here. And so what does that tell us? Well, it kind of tells us that as many local governments have found their tax sources constrained, local governments have relied more on these fees, but the kind of reality is that some services are better suited to others than these fees, right? And as local governments expand their use of fees, one might ask if the low-hanging fruit, meaning those services that are most easily, where fees are most easily applied, after that fruit is picked, fees might be, there might be pressure to start applying fees to other services that are not as well suited for a fee-for-service model. And this could cause local governments to rely more on fines, imposed fees, and maybe even asset forfeitures as revenue-raising tools. And in many cases, they're not going to be well suited for revenue-raising tools. And just as an example, would be considered the civil unrest in Ferguson, Missouri a few years ago, meaning 2014. And some observers of that point to the oversized role of public safety and court fines and fees in the city's budget as a factor in this unrest. And the contention there was that the city's public safety and municipal court system had become focused on revenue raising and not on providing fair treatment under the law. And this led to Ferguson residents distrust government and law enforcement. And now this isn't a thing that's limited just to Ferguson. This is actually a national trend we're observing in GFOA, is that many governments are kind of taking a step back and thinking about the impact of fines and fees and the impact of those on the community's more like economically disadvantaged citizens. The idea of being here is that your traditional taxes have been aligned with some ability to pay, right? With like income taxes, an obvious one, even property taxes where property values are an indicator of wealth. Fines and fees, maybe not quite the same, right? Because if you have a, let's just say, a $200 fine, that fine is going to be a lot different impact on someone's life who makes, $100,000 a year versus someone who makes like $50,000 a year, just for example. So there's been a number of counties, for instance, that have eliminated or significantly curtailed court fines and fees in recent years for that reason, and we just have a partial list of some of those right here. And so the idea being, though, could this trend reach your city at some point, right? So this seems to be a thing that nationally is occurring, and we have a little report here that reviews some of these trends if you're interested in it. And it goes back to this point of your priors, right? If you just assume, well, fines and fees will just continue to be an important revenue just as they always have, but there seems to be this national trend pushing back on that now. One might ask if they will continue to be a growth area for local governments in the future, and that could impact your forecast.
So I think now's a great time to do that polling question.
Let's do it.
Angela? Does it look sunny? Well, you're asking a bunch of bean counters if it looks sunny, so we might say yes no matter what.
Rain is good.
Oh, so the panelists can't answer, huh?
John?
No, we can't answer it.
John?
Yes.
Yeah, it's not allowing you to answer.
Yeah, the panelists don't answer. We will get credit for attendance.
Looks
Hopefully,
cloudy by you, Jerry.
excuse me,
Looks cloudy by you.
it's very cloudy. Cloudy, it looks like a hurricane coming your way.
Exactly.
So we've got about 85% of the people have answered. We needed a couple more. This is how you guys get credit. So let's keep pushing.
We want everybody to get credit.
You can see it, John?
I cannot. I'm reading Angela's post to us as panelists. Somebody says they can't see the question. That was Jason Frost.
Okay.
Alejandra Alvarez said did not get the pop-up.
It is a pop-up, so it could be in the background.
The audio on this session is much better than the first. Just a comment.
There's no one saying they saw the question but could not answer. Angela, are we done? How many people we have in?
We're done enough.
All right.
So far, we're-
We're 90%. We're good.
All right, cool. That was well timed because I did a little screen switch. So I'm assuming you all see Excel right now.
Yep.
Correct? All right, cool. I'm going to talk a little bit because the question was, all right, another question was, well, how might we think about uncertainty here in our revenue? So I'm going to just show you a little work that we're doing in GFOA. So this little model we're building to help people think about uncertainty. So the question here is like, well, what tax categories I have? I have property tax. How much am I forecasting? I'm forecasting 10 million for that. I'm also forecast. I also have, let's say, another important is building license. So we'll just keep this simple. I've got two revenue types, property and building license. I'm going to say I've got 5 million in building licenses for a total of 15. And my goal, meaning my spending plan, is 15 million. So what we've done at GFOA is we have gone and captured data from about 30 cities of different sizes and types across the country and compared their forecasts for these types of tax revenues to the actual revenue they received. And the value of doing that is we found the difference between their forecasts and their actuals. And those differences tell us the chance of the local governments actually meeting their forecast, right? So what we see here on the right-hand side is a little distribution, kind of the shape here indicates the spread of the forecast. So we see that by this little shape here, it shows us that, most of the time they're going to be in the neighborhood, but if we go to the right and left, yeah, there's some outliers where people sometimes aren't as close. And same with the 5 here, a little distribution of the amount of the forecast versus the actual for their business license. And kind of the kicker here, the real takeaway from this model is that by doing this, we get a chance of meeting the forecast. So by using all these different experiences from different local governments, seeing how accurate they've been, and assuming their past accuracy would be a reasonable indicator of future accuracy, we can get a chance of the forecast meeting the plan. And we do this for different economic eras. So the good old days, pre-2007, things are pretty stable. So you know what, if you forecast 15 million, you have a spending plan of 15 million, you've got about a 70% chance of making that plan. Not so bad, right? Now, what about if we get to like 2009, 2010, which is throws the Great Recession? Well, not so good. Now you're down to basically a coin flip chance of making your forecast, so that is probably not as good. So you might say, well, yeah, if I'm forecasting 15, maybe we should only plan on spending 14.5 million, and that gets 78. So that's not so bad. 78's okay. I mean, it still leaves a 20% chance, 1 in 5 of not making our spending plan. If we love that. What if we said 14? Well, I've got a 90% chance, so that's better. So maybe we budget 14 million worth of expenditures, and maybe that extra 5, that 0.5 in as in 14.5. Maybe we have $500,000 in special projects that we'll only do if the revenue forecasts are looking good halfway through the year, but we'll plan on, like, say, salaries or something like that, and other sort of ongoing expenditures that are a little harder to cut back, we'll only plan on those at 14 million because that gives us 90% chance. So just a little project that GFOA is working on right now to help local governments get their arms around forecasting a bit better in the uncertainty. So you'll be seeing a bit more about this as it becomes further developed. So with that, go back to our PowerPoint. And with that, we're going to have some time here for comments from our panelists. So John, Roy, or Jerry, give you guys a chance to weigh in here on what you've seen and thoughts that you have on the forecasting environment in New Jersey.
Roy, you're up.
Okay. So one of the aspects of New Jersey that's been devastating on the revenue side has been our municipal courts. Do you have any trends on the Northeast in general as far as the devastation of revenue on municipal governments, particularly with the court system? We saw your slides on the housing, and I think everybody here would agree, the housing industry is on the uptick, including revenues for those that can open for the general public to secure building permits. Do you have any data on the court devastation revenue?
You know, we don't have national data on court fines and fees. No, that's not really something that's been collected. It's usually a bit, you know, say behind because it comes in with like your general budget reporting and CAFR reporting, which is done at the end of the year and not really real time.
Okay, good, John.
So Shane, I warned Shane ahead of time. I found an article that Shane wrote back in June of 2019 for the GFOA magazine. The subject was stress testing your reserves with advanced analytical techniques, which was, for me, was a great article. He's got some tools that he uses in order to project and figure out what stress testing you should subject your reserves to. We all know that if you didn't have adequate reserves going into this right now, you're pretty much screwed, and it's going to be floundering. Rather than having these reserves in place well ahead of a pandemic or any other emergency, allows us to prepare better for these issues. So Shane, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, because I think that some of the techniques and the tools you use were pretty neat.
Sure. Yeah, so it's very similar to some of the stuff we saw, like, for example, the AAA approach to managing uncertainty would be number one, except that you might need to use reserves and accept that they are a risk management tool, right? Many folks don't think of them as explicitly being a risk management tool, but when you do, I think it opens up possibilities of thinking about reserves a little bit different. And what are the risks that your reserves are intended to address? So a big one being economic uncertainty, of course. So looking at what happened to your revenues during the Great Recession and the 2001 recessions are pretty good analogs or reference cases, because the 2008 was the worst recession since 1950. 2001 was one of the least worst, I guess. And so in between there, you'd have the middle ground. So you cover really the whole range of possibilities. So if your reserves were just sufficient to cover 2008, that tells you, well, according to kind of our assessment of past history, we would be good. But you may remember the last A in AAA is to augment. So you wouldn't want to assume that the Great Recession was the worst possible recession. And again, who knows how COVID is going to turn out at this point. But certainly some people were thinking that this could even top the 2008 Great Recession. So using the AAA approach, I think can be important. The governments that have used it prior to all this happening were pretty well prepared, because they recognized 2008 wasn't the worst possible thing. And the same applies to natural disasters as well. Great story on that is another wildfire story, this time for a city, where we were working with a city government to assess their risks, and one of the risks being wildfire. And a couple of years ago, they had the worst wildfire in state history hit their town. And so we were using that data to analyze future potential risks from wildfire. And then we had to stop the project in the middle because there was a new wildfire and so on. So, but because the wildfires are a real risk. And so as we get through, we modeled out, but we said, well, that wildfire that had occurred We can't assume that was the worst possible ever in the future, because that would be violating the AAA rule. So we augmented their reserves, and then 2 years later, they had the new worst wildfire in state history hit the town. And so they were, though, fully prepared for that because they had augmented their expectation for risk. So I think using the AAA approach is useful not only for forecasting, but also for thinking about your reserves. All right, any other comments, or should we press on?
I think we should press on.
All right. And
There is one question from the group, if we want to field it.
oh, sure. Yeah, let's see. I did the question here.
Just what about parking fees, permits, and interest on investments?
Yeah. Let's see. So the kind of permit information that is, let me show you the slide again. Oops. Go backward. There you go. That is new privately owned housing permits authorized by building permits. So that is something you can pull from the census, and they do have it broken down by like general regions. I didn't pull a region for this presentation because it was kind of a little unclear which of the regions New Jersey would fall into. So I didn't want to present the wrong region, but you can pull national stuff and you can pull by regions from the census to get information on permits. And they tend to go single family housing permits. They don't really get into very granular types of permits, but I would say that is the best resource on permit information that I'm aware of. And then as far as parking, I am not familiar with a good national resource on parking. So what I would probably suggest there is, and we'll get to this in a little bit actually, is developing local resources, like local subject matter experts that are closer to the ground. Like if you've got people that say work on the street and are like monitoring meters, whatever else, like those folks are super close to the action, and getting people's perspectives who are close to the action is often an excellent thing to do, especially in uncertain situations. We'll actually show a little bit about that in some of the slides coming up.
And I think a lot of it has to do with your dependence on those revenues. Like I know I talked to Doug Pettix on his way up before he retired from New Brunswick, and New Brunswick relies heavily on those revenues from the parking utility. Nobody was going to New Brunswick and nobody was parking there. So they were taking a huge hit on their parking revenue.
Yeah.
So again, I think it depends upon the makeup of your revenue, how much you rely on it.
Yeah, that's a great point. We'll be showing some tools for getting your mind around that here in just a minute. So good segue. All right. So first, so these are, let me back up. So kind of, we talked about assessing your current situation, and now let's augment. So how do you augment your capabilities? So the first thing I might suggest to you is, if you do not have a short-term cash flow monitoring tool, you might want to consider getting one. So what we've got here on the slide is and we can make this very easy for you, is if you check out the April 24th webinar, Managing Cash Flow in a Crisis, available for free on the GFOA website. There are instructions on how to build a cash flow model, including a little Excel template that you can download and just enter your own data in, and you will be good to go. And it produces a model that looks a bit like what I've got on the slide here. So this is showing the flow of cash in and out. And if it's gray, that means you're in the positive. If it's red, you're in the negative. And let me just pull up Excel here, and I'll show you guys kind of what this looks like in real life. So hopefully you can see my Excel model right now. And essentially you're entering this. I've got this one pretending that your fiscal year end is February 2021. So your prior year is going to be March 2019 through February 2020. You enter your historical data here, and the model basically projects that forward in a little pattern, and it kind of tells you, gives you a clue, like, hey, where are those kind of dips and or the inclines and declines happening, so you can then better prepare yourself for those inclines and declines. And the folks that have put this model together have found it incredibly valuable for augmenting their capability for getting their minds around the short-term fluctuations in their revenues, which has given a lot of confidence not only to the finance office, but also surprisingly elected officials can get very into this because it gives them kind of confidence and comfort that the situation is well managed and kind of they can see the direction things are going. So again, if you don't have such a model, I would encourage you to check it out. I think I can show you here where to get it. So we go to gfaway.org/fiscal first aid. You will, let's just do it live so I can show you guys. So you will see a screen a lot like this, and you can then view fiscal first aid resources, clear out, get rid of all that, and look for video recordings. And you will see down here under managing cash flow in a crisis, April 24th, watch the video. And if you want the tool, clear it out again and just hit tools and templates, and there's your cash flow forecasting tool. So you can very easily access that stuff for free on the GFOA website. All right, so moving on, another tool is scenario planning. And the idea here is there's this tension between wanting to take action and knowing your situation better. And scenario planning is a way to move forward in this uncertain environment. And the idea here is it's going to allow you to identify plans for the future, but without having to over specify the problem, meaning you can't forecast exactly what the revenue is going to be in the future. So how do you handle that? And scenario planning is one way to do it because it allows you to develop plans that are going to be resilient under different conditions. So let's give you an example. So this is from a webinar we did about scenario planning on April 8th, also available, same spot if you wanted to watch that webinar that I just showed you. But I'll just kind of walk you through the idea of this particular graphic. So we see here, we begin by identifying some of the essential versus non-essential services. And if we flatten the curve, you can go up. So it kind of not so bad, meaning I should say this is so, depending on what the impact is, like if you have tourism, in this case, sales, whatever, you might need to impact a furlough policy if things are not going so well. And then as you go through this path, there's going to be more uncertainty, of course. You need to stay mindful of what's going on in the environment. So having different triggers that are going to be salient to your town, like I think John mentioned, if you've got a lot of tourism or other sorts of things in those communities, thinking about what are indicators of tourism or indicators of if it's parking, what are leading indicators of how much parking there might be. So keeping your eye on those indicators and having different decision points along the way to think about, well, if the economy breaks one way, be prepared. If the economy breaks a different way, we're going to be prepared. And the little slide here, we see a range of different possibilities, all the way from kind of an L-shaped recovery. You may have heard that, where that's probably that's the least good option. And then you have the little V, which is the best option, where that means the economy bounces right back. So you might have a range of different responses depending on what scenario plays out. So kind of really game planning out different possible futures and having indicators that are relevant to your community to help judge the direction things are going. And I'll get a little bit into how you might start to develop those indicators in a few minutes. So before we do that, though, let's talk about the game plan. So I mentioned there's these different scenarios you might wish to plan for. So you could do little menus of strategies go along with your forecast. So if it turns out to be a little V-shaped recovery, that means we can rely on, we'll say, less stringent sorts of strategies. Like, for example, just holding some vacancies open might be good enough. If you're doing a deeper V recovery, that means like the economy is not bouncing back as quickly and the recession is deeper. You might need to look at other strategies like furloughs. So there's a lot of examples of different types of strategies you might employ on this slide. And I'll give you some resources in just a minute to develop even more types of strategies if you need them. And also thinking about the W and L approaches. So W's means like a double dip kind of recession where things go up and down, and L meaning it kind of just drags out for a while. And you might need to think of more like further reaching types of strategies, like thinking about what your core services are versus your non-core services, so you can cut back those non-core items, or even looking for opportunities to share resources with local governments or the private sector where you hadn't done that before. And I'll give you some more resources to work through those types of problems as well. And here are those resources. So these are different reports that are available at that same website I just showed you, gfoa.org/FFA. And these are essentially catalogs of different cost-cutting strategies that you can use. So these, when we have here, are less severe cost-cutting strategies. So these might be like, well, you know, we just need some lighter cost-cutting strategies. These can help you out. If you need to, there's kind of the cash flow thing. If you need a little further reaching types of strategies, we have Balancing Budget in Bad Times, Part 1 and 2, which get into the strategies that are a little riskier sometimes, but can also result in larger cost savings. So many options here for you to use to come up with your own approaches to these different scenarios. All right, so the kind of next point I want to get into here is, well, what are some key practices for forecasting under conditions of extreme uncertainty? So if you're thinking about scenario planning or really any other sort of forecast exercise, what sort of practices might you want to be mindful of? So we talked about reference cases or analogs, so I won't beat on that one anymore. But the kind of new point here is engage subject matter experts in the forecast. So who are the people close to the action that you might want to engage? So that can include, for example, like property tax, if that's a big revenue. The assessor, it could be local businesses that pay taxes, like large taxpayers. Maybe your building department, people are issuing the permits. These folks are really the folks that have their fingers on the pulse of the factors influencing your revenue sources. In fact, some of the governments that do the best work at forecasting have standing panels of these types of subject matter experts that they consult for forecast information. So you may even think of doing the same thing for the same thing for your community. Get folks who have their fingers on the pulse of this kind of action, of the day-to-day action that result in your revenues, and have them get their insight into the direction things are going. And you don't need like a ton of people to do this. So it isn't like, well, you need to get like 30 people or 50 people or something like that. Even a small number can be quite useful. And I'm gonna skip this slide. This slide convinces you that you don't need a large number of people since we're running short of time. We'll get on to the next practice for forecasting under uncertainty. And so the next practice is to organize your information into a model of some kind. And so a saying from a famous statistician, George Box, is that all models are wrong and some are useful. And the idea here is that everyone has some kind of model for how the world works. And a key difference is whether that model is implicit, meaning it's just in your head, or is it explicit, meaning it's on a piece of paper or in a spreadsheet. And I would submit to you that if it's explicit, it's going to be easier to share that model with other people, to get feedback and to use that model consistently. So let's just, for example, imagine you put together a panel of the subject matter experts like I advocated for on the last slide. If you had a model that you could share with them, it would be a lot easier for everyone to work together to figure out, okay, what kind of factors are influencing the economic activity that we cared about? What type of indicators does the finance officer need to keep their eye on? I'm going to show you an example of this from real life. This is a model that was used for sales tax by a city out west. So this is a real life thing that they've put together. And what it shows is that the green is their sales tax yield. And I know sales tax isn't the big revenue in New Jersey, but you can put any revenue you want in a model like this, like property tax, building permit, parking, or whatever. And you then map out the things that influence sales tax. So in their case, tax rate's important, and voter approval for tax is important, and trustworthiness of the city as a taxing entity influences voter approval for taxes, which influences the tax rate. So if they feel that people in the community don't have high trust in city government, they can't expect them to approve tax increases, and you might even want to do a rollback of taxes. And then there's on the other side, the blue side is total taxable sales. So that's a function of purchases made which is a function of tourist spending, which is a big deal in this particular community, local consumers, and so on and so forth. And I think it's easy to imagine how you could have a similar model like this for, say, property taxes, where property tax yield would be a function of things like the amount of new housing that is getting built, the appreciation or depreciation of existing building stock, collection rates. All of these things would play into property tax revenues, and you could build a model that lists out some of the influencing factors that you would expect to change the direction of any of those indicators, and having some of the subject matter experts that have the pulse, the fingers on the pulse of these types of issues could be very helpful in assisting the finance office in better understanding these items as the forecast is being developed. And now just bear in mind that this model doesn't have to be perfect. As we say, you just need to outrun the bear. And what that is referring to is a little story that goes like this, where there's two guys walking through the woods and they see a sign that says, "Beware of bears." And one of the friends starts putting on his running shoes, and the other friend says, "Hey, you can't outrun a bear." And the first guy says, "Well, I don't need to outrun the bear, I just need to outrun you." And the kind of takeaway there is your model doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be better than what you have now. And I might submit to you, if you don't have a model, or if the model is implicit, just getting started will be an improvement over the current situation.
So Shane, unfortunately, we're out of time. And I'm going to use this as an opportunity to plug that the National GFOA's got a ton of resources online. I know you've got several books that are available for people to purchase if they'd like to. I know I'm going through your one right now on forecasting, but I think then there it is. They're great tools that are available, and it's different than what we look at just from our New Jersey view. It's got more of a national or international view on revenue approach, analysis, and projecting.
Well, the good news is the beat the bear was pretty much my last point. So you guys saw pretty well everything. So but thank you for having me here today, and I hope that this presentation proved beneficial.
Thanks for joining us. Do we have any questions? Looks like we have a question from the audience.
Will the PowerPoint be available? Yes, so I would be happy to share this PowerPoint.
Yep, and I believe we are recording everything. Yep, the recording button's on. I think we're going to have that available to our membership after the conference is over with as well. All right, there's no more questions. Shane, thank you very much. We appreciate your joining us.
All right, you're welcome.
All right, have a great day.
You too.